My name is Jack Wenzinger. I am part of the media entertainment vertical inside Amazon Web Services, where I have the fortunate role of being able to work with our fabulous technology partners as they're leveraging AWS to support large meaningful customers in the media entertainment industry. So with that, let me just allow us to kind of explain our roles real quickly. Mike, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, Mike Kralec. I'm the VP of Technical Operations and Deputy CTO for Sinclair. I've been with Sinclair for a little over 20 years now, for anywhere from software development, databases, systems, and ran IT for a few years. Now I'm on the media technology side of Sinclair.
And I'm Joe Ashby. I'm Senior Solutions Architect with Imagine Communications. I've been here for 5 years, and I've been primarily working in optimizing Versio for AWS.
All right, thanks, guys. So, I guess we probably want to start. I'm going to start. We're just going to kind of do a Q&A here, and then get into, allow us to just kind of talk about each other's backgrounds and technology and what's being brought to market here. So, Mike, I'm going to start with you. Obviously, Sinclair is a leading provider of sports and news content. You operate over 190 television stations. You're in, close to 90 markets and deliver on multiple platforms. As a CTO of that type of infrastructure and the demands that entails, can you give us just kind of a little insight, day in the life, as far as the architecture you're managing and some of the challenges you face?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that each of those markets is in essence a small video-centric data center. It's essentially, it's all of the operations required with the requisite support for the towers and the transmitters and if there's news, the news production operations, if there's other production facilities, those facilities. So, they've run as independent entities, independent operations, for a very long time, and there's been some advance there, as we saw, like network connectivity advancement, things like that. We went to some hub models where we took master control and centralized it into a single location that made sense from a network perspective. But a lot of it is still the on-premise legacy, capabilities, the production, distribution architectures that really evolved over time. So there's a lot of human capital, and there's a lot of computer capital in each of those locations.
Yeah, and just quickly, how have you been operating since we've had COVID-19?
It's actually, I have to give a shout out to all of our local engineers. Chief engineers and whatnot have really taken their hats off, with regards to solutioning in sort of a time of crisis for us, as we kept people home, as we had to continue to support all of those local resources. It meant a lot of scrambling for them, and I think it really it foretells sort of how we'll be in the future, that we can even continue to operate the way we have been, very successfully, honestly, in light of the current situation. But I think it will be this is a new normal for us. I think it really does mean, how are we going to take a different perspective on operations in the future.
Cool. So let's switch over to Joe. So Joe, let's talk about Imagine Communications. I know the main spearhead here is to talk about Versio, and Versio is kind of a short name for a lot of technology modules. It's a substantial platform as it operates. It seems like there's a lot of individual components that can work separately, but they all kind of work in concert to provide some massive broadcast playout services. Do you want to just,
Right.
give us an overview of Versio and modular playout?
Yeah, absolutely. So Versio platform is a suite of services that are designed around the idea that every broadcaster has a different set of requirements and needs for each project. So in thinking this way, we designed Versio to be a very modular system capable of many functions and services. And just like with building blocks, you can assemble its components into the exact solution that fits the unique requirements of your project. So first we start with core services, right? That's the heart of every Versio platform installation. It's our proprietary software plus databases, load balancers, and messaging systems. And that's really what makes it so scalable and gives it a lot of power and flexibility to be so modular like that, which makes it perfect for deployment in cloud. Next is the Playout Engine. They run on Xenium. That's our modular and configurable blueprint system, and it allows us to assemble all the pieces of a channel and any customer-defined configuration, like different audio components or options, different caption options, or different graphics options. Speaking of graphics, you have the full legacy support of all the standard graphics features, and then our advanced rendering engine is also fully supported in AWS. With Content Portal, that's the MAM component of the system, and it's designed to be very much a sort of a create your own sort and search system by allowing the user to really manipulate and build out their unique sorting methods. So it also comes with all the asset tagging, timing, and marking tools, a MAM system would need. And it has some really unique metadata capabilities built in as well when it's tied to Versio automation, which is the next piece of the puzzle. So for Versio automation, this is the shortest one, I promise. It's the next gen automation list management service, and it's really designed for deployment anywhere, which again makes it perfect for cloud. And then finally, the redundancy service, which gives you either full or partial synchronization of your lists and controls across your channels, even when they're operating in separate availability zones. So the redundancy service will help us create even geographic redundancy in AWS. And all of those services are available with Versio and AWS right now.
And you've been working to put this platform and integrate it with AWS services now. We've been working together since 2018, correct?
It's been a while, yeah.
It's been a journey. So, and speaking of that journey, I know that you've learned an awful lot about AWS as we've gone through this, and we often talk about leadership principles like being customer obsessed and diving deep and earning trust. But really, it's about having passion in trying to solve real problems and really listening to customer feedback. And I noted during the time as you guys were modifying Versio and building it into the AWS cloud structure that you were really taking a lot of the feedback from your customers directly into the innovation and the work that you guys were doing. So now that we have Sinclair on the call, as a customer, and then you as a technology partner, I kind of wanted to get your insights in this process as far as how did you feel like feedback influenced the commitment, to a project.
Are you asking me or Mike?
Yeah. So let's start with Mike. Let's start with the customer.
Okay. Sure.
Okay. We've worked with Imagine for years. I think I've worked with Imagine personally since 2003. Excuse me. Very long-standing relationship. Very comfortable with Imagine overall. They've been a great partner for us in many different ways. It's been in this case. It was great. I mean, the part of it is, we were really talking about nuts and bolts items here. There was a very concrete vision of what had to be done. So we had some detailed architecture decisions or discussions, sort of based around what was our risk tolerance. Where did we want to, how do we want to approach things? Really, what items were critical to success? All of those things. So, it was a good cycle with Imagine. Sort of throwing over the wall as we walk through all the standard operating procedures that we're going to have to go through for going towards cloud playout. Just continuous conversations of you know, and I go back to my software development stuff too often, like if this then that, if this then that, you know, how are we understanding all of the potential dimensions of the problem, and it was great discussions. It was a constant feedback loop, I'd say, for us, and good for us to help, you know, learn the platform, learn how Versio was going to run on AWS for us, and what the key you know, decision points were for us. It was good feedback.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep, and then to add on to that, you know, I think, Mike, as we worked towards these common goals, we started to boil down all of these different things to just a few points, right? And you know, what I identified was cost effectiveness, growth potential, and security and reliability, which, Jack, as you're well aware, all of those items are key points in the well-architected framework, which we really took to heart when beginning our optimization efforts. And, you know, for each one of those, like cost effectiveness, you know, and thank you, moderator, for pulling up the design of the environment. So, you know, we focused first on identifying every single piece of core services that we could replace with an AWS service, right? And here's where the real magic happens, is that there's nearly an AWS service for everything. So if we need databases, you've got redundancy, auto-scaling, snapshot recovery built right in. So of course we'd want to use RDS for that. If we need a load balancing, you've got a service for that too. The Elastic Load Balancer works great right out of the box, given that you set it up correctly. You know, you have your own, you know, messaging queue services, media services, on and on and on. So nearly everywhere we looked into core services, there was an AWS service that we could pretty easily swap places with, right? With what would have been a much more expensive solution, say using a cluster of instances to perform the same tasks. Under growth potential, you know, I think, Mike, you would say that you definitely want to know the environment you're building in isn't just cost effective, but also is going to grow with your needs, right? So running Versio in AWS, it gives us so much flexibility to grow and expand a network on not only on the fly, but it gives broadcasters the ability to, you know, either rapidly expand your infrastructure for an urgent need or to scale and grow over time, you know, slowly adding channels to your lineup. And then lastly, talk about, you know, security. It's obviously one of the most vital aspects of the operations, at least in my opinion. And removing the on-prem data center and migrating to AWS, it's sort of like an instant gain in security, right? Given the really granular control, the pretty powerful access management and rights tools. So, you know, AWS has sort of done the work of laying a secure foundation for us to build our architecture on.
That shared security model.
Right.
Infrastructure was already taken care of, and as you're using managed services, it raises the security posture of running those. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, you know, one of the things I enjoyed as we were going through this, Joe, was the realization that, you know, media processing services, you know, the cost efficiencies you can get by running, you know, per second type charge services versus by the hour charge type services. So switching from you know, Windows-based, you know, per hour charge instances to something like Media Convert, where, you know, in a transcode, you know, just paying for the amount of time that you're using on that type of processing, something that you know, enjoyed watching you guys do all of that discovery.
Brett, thank you.
So again, you know, to both of you, you know, what was the moment where you realized you were stepping into a different methodology than on-prem that made you excited to continue through this, you know, through the POC and, you know, continue down the road?
Yeah, I was. I'll take this first, Joe, if you don't mind.
Sure, please.
I tell you, we were really excited when we knew we could sort of, this could be more greenfield for us. Like, we got to leave a lot of legacy thinking behind. We got to focus on the things that were important to us, and not focus on the items that were going to be less relevant. So we did focus a lot on how to minimize operational disruption, right? How to smoothly handle a migration, how to handle media management in a cloud-based environment. A lot of things, you know, besides that, ended up just being exception handling. So what excites me is that we weren't tied. We weren't tied to really any thinking about how this had to operate, besides, you know, the correct distribution, obviously, and the correct playlist generation, all that kind of stuff. But we weren't really constrained here, so we had the flexibility to be creative, and I think that's really something that drives me as a person, is just creativity. How do we incorporate that? How do we continue to innovate over time? How do we build that into the system? We did make sure that we weren't putting up walls for our future selves. So Joe mentioned potential for expansion. We want to make sure that flexibility is there, that we don't sort of constrain innovation for Sinclair. But at the same time, it's just it's great to be able to take a fresh look at this and really, I think, create the best product or the best solution for us, with our partners. Not really thinking too much about how we used to do things.
So, Mike, just before we leave that, so what would be an example of a quick decision you were able to make where, in the past it might have taken some time?
I'd say the partners that we use for some media prep, having all of, I guess the biggest thing is really those content partners, whether that's commercial spot copy, whether it's promos, whether it's full program material, having all of that content come directly to the cloud. There was no question about it. There was never a conversation about, well, we'll bring it here and then we'll bounce it to this other site and then we'll do the transcode over here. That was sort of off the table in the very beginning. If we're gonna be cloud-based, we're going to deliver the media to the cloud in the first place. And we had to probably, we had to spend more cycles on that, because that was more operational disruption, I'd say. But in the end, we're left with a better solution because of it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
Nice. Well, so the next question, let's get back to, you brought up the well-architected framework. So, this is an AWS best practice or white paper. It was originally generated by solutions architects back, I think it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago now. But essentially, as they were talking about, customer challenges and problems, they kept finding the exact same types of challenges that were impacting, growth and scale and security, resiliency and cost issues for, running optimally in the cloud. So that was really how the well-architected framework came out, and how it generated the different pillars that it did. Is it's essentially the structured approach of taking advantage of everything in the cloud. And Joe, I know that you kind of became an evangelist for us, as you were reading through this. We had multiple workshops last year, worked through a lot of different components. So let me kind of direct this more towards you, as far as, an example of, one of the pillars that changed, Versio platform running in AWS.
Well, first off, I'd say we definitely, we took the well-architected framework to heart. Like you just said, you get asked the same questions over and over and over. Eventually, they begin to reveal the pattern, and that pattern really is sort of the 5 pillars that you have identified. And I think right off the top, reliability, efficiency, and cost optimization pillars, really, they sort of lit our path, right? As we walk through all the available services and capabilities, and they forced us to look at our implementation strategy and our go-forward strategy in new ways. I think it's, again, the cloud is a very different world than any other you work in, and just the fact that, you had a document to help me understand, the nature of cloud more fully, and how it's a sort of a continuous evolution, right? And we need to look at our optimization the same way, as a constant or a continuous evolution. And so in that way, as the cloud environment evolves, so do we, and we don't get left behind and become complacent. We're constantly optimizing and constantly looking for the next way to save cost for the next customer project, or save cost on all, existing customer projects, because that should work laterally both ways. So, and then of course you have to mention the security pillar, right? It's the most important pillar, and like I've said before, I think AWS has provided a great foundation for us to build our Playout networks on.
I don't know. Yes, security is absolutely the first priority. But I liked your story on resiliency, where you were talking. I think it was six levels of resiliency within the Versio platform.
Oh, sure, yeah. And that talks a little bit about, you know, what I've sort of begun calling in my documentation the AWS air chain. But we've identified so many different areas of redundancy throughout all of the media services that exist. And then, you know, even back if you're using an LTN provider in your own environment, you're still getting geographic redundancy on your channel instances using availability zones. You're still getting, you know, redundancy across the instances using our redundancy service. So building in AWS, you've opened up a lot of new opportunities for an air chain that remains reliable and consistent across the entire broadcast path.
Nice. You know, we talked about the speed. You know, Mike was indicating that he was able to move a lot faster, and I know that Joe, you've also indicated, you know, you guys are leveraging infrastructure as code in a lot of places in the Versio platform. So, you know, can you describe to me, you know, what's the setup experience differ for customers today? Say, if you wanted to set up a two-channel system, you know, to get started.
Right. Well, so, you know, in any deployment, we've made the decision to use Terraform as our base deployment system. So we're not standing an environment up by hand, right? We've worked hand in hand with some third-party partners to craft a deployment environment or a deployment tool set that lets us stand up the VPC and all the trimmings inside of it and make sure that they're all architected exactly based on the rules of the well-architected framework to make sure that we're secure, resilient, reliable, all of those things. And then within that, we're deploying that environment. So, you know, the way I like to tell the story to broadcasters is, you know, you're buying a building, you're staffing it with people, you're, you know, putting HVAC in, you're standing up a rack of gear, you're filling the rack with gear, and then you're networking all the equipment, installing the OSs and the licenses, and then you connect a keyboard and a mouse and a monitor to that rack and say, here, engineer, go work. We're doing all of that in a simple deployment strategy that is really fast, really effective. It keeps the environment clean and well optimized, and it really doesn't allow for a lot of failure in that deployment. So, you know, you look at it in that way as well, where you're saving, you know, potentially millions and millions of dollars, even over a short-term amount of time, without having to worry about a facilities cost and security cost, HVAC cost, power cost. All of those different costs, you know, provide a pretty significant, you know, benefit to moving to cloud. And then I think, you know, on the architecture, on the implementation side, for our professional services installation teams, it's going to provide a much more sort of it's going to provide a much more a path that's easier in these installations. You know, we're not worried about, you know, weeks and weeks of on-site installation and support or T&E. You know, there's no travel time now, there's no expenses and all of that, versus just, you know, remotely working with your team from home and deploying all of your resources with scripting tools. So it's a complete shift away from what we're used to.
My guess is I'm watching Mike, and it looks like he's remembering a lot of these physical installation projects that he's got.
Yeah, but you know, I was thinking more along the lines of just, you know, this wasn't something that kept us up at night, and that's something. There's something to be said for that, right? Is that there wasn't, you know, different from a physical installation. There's a lot more adaptability in this system, right? We've got shorter windows for rollout, you know, all of these on all of these different services, and we got to a point where, you know, the platform wasn't an issue for us. It wasn't a concern. It became the, you know, sort of truly a cloud piece where all we're concerned with was the services that are running, not the platform itself. You know, I think the platform could be. We were really comfortable, and this may be a reflection of the like I said, a long-standing partnership with Imagine, but very comfortable knowing that you know, depending on, I mentioned, you know, sort of we had dimensions to consider, like what were critical issues for us and what weren't, and sort of accommodating the 80%, 80, 90% of things. This system could have turned out much differently from a platform perspective or from an architecture perspective, and it could have happened really quickly, right? So as we did turn up things, and architecture changes were necessary. This wasn't something where we had to go back to manufacturers. We had to order stuff. We had to think about how we were going to reconnect, this or connect this piece in. We're essentially, changing a few words on paper and then updating Imagine with why the changes are occurring. But really rapid, I'd say almost like rapid prototyping of the environment,
Sure.
But on a production level. So it's good.
So
That's a great way to put it.
Or history of projects from the time you decided to have the first meeting to discuss the design and build for a POC to this engagement, what would be a comparative timescale?
This is going to be 50% of the time, if that. I mean, we're dramatically improving our speed of our velocity here. It's incredible, and I'll say that there was a lot of upfront design work, a lot of conversations, but that was the longer part of the process, right? Was getting of knowing what our objective and really sort of solidifying all of the upfront wrangling of issues here and there. The deployment itself and really the path forward is a third of the time. It's more work up front, not more work than it traditionally is. It's the same work up front now, but the deployment speed is vastly improved.
So it's the same amount of work. How much, what's the manpower resource required to get this going on your side as far as the team? Is it a bigger team or is it kind of a strike?
So I don't know. This may just be me, but look, it may be a reflection of my software development background or just how I like to work. But we kept this small. We have 4 people in Sinclair. That's it, working on this. Moving 3 entire network channels with 4 people. This became I was really concerned with our speed and agility throughout this. So we didn't dedicate a ton of resources to it. We leaned heavily on, and I didn't say this earlier, we have a long-standing partnership with AWS also, right? We've been on AWS for digital for 7-8 years now. A lot of comfort there, and so we lean on our partners and we lean on a very small, flexible, agile team inside of Sinclair to address operational concerns, and we pull in resources. Right? Obviously, we're not in a vacuum here, but each of those people is pulling in the resources and consolidating the information necessary to execute, and not passing this off to others, but sort of bringing that knowledge back into the group, and helping us keep the velocity going, because we're not bringing people up to speed all the time. We're really keeping that core group focused on this, and just really focused on speed of execution.
Yeah, so that goes along with something that AWS will frequently talk about, what we call a cloud center of excellence. And essentially, it is a strike team within a company that is, specifically focused on the best practices within AWS to make sure they get implemented. But I'll often talk about how, in the M&E industry specifically, there needs to be a media-centric center of excellence that dovetails with that group, making sure that business platform priorities and economics and strategy thinking are also brought into that CCOE organization as you're directing cloud technologies. Because in AWS you'll have you have the collapse of organizations that have traditionally been separate on-prem, where security and development and operations they need to be working very closely together to make sure that all the infrastructure runs appropriately. So no, that's great validation of all of that. Thanks, Mike. So I know that we had to consider new ways of doing things and migrating the platform to AWS, and Versio is used for critical broadcast services. That was made clear to us from the very first meeting, Joe. It was always that Versio is a leading brand as far as split-second failover and a lot of capabilities for broadcast services. what considerations did you run into in addressing the, the resiliency in Versio, and how did you leverage AWS components for that?
Well, actually, I think there are a couple answers to that question, but before I get there, I want to mention first what I've identified as sort of the 5 key points that AWS is bringing to Versio as a platform. That's scalability and unlimited channel growth, it's redundancy options, it's performance and monitoring with CloudTrail and CloudWatch, it's data resiliency with, automated database scaling and encryption on everything. And like, with encryption, it's security with a secure perimeter, and the ability to nest security groups, use NACLs and do heavily permissioned access rights. So the way I look at cloud migration has been like this. All of these features are now part of Versio. We're trying to bring, the best of your cloud into our environment. So, we've seen the cloud from the very beginning as a way to strengthen the platform with its unique capabilities, which is the other side of the optimization coin, right? We're not just creating cost savings, we're adding more resiliency and more security and more reliability by optimizing all of those things. So all of that to say, here are my 2 points. One, and I've already mentioned these really, but resiliency, gaining automated database backups, doing instant scalability of services and channels, a backup and restore capability with CloudWatch monitoring. That's a huge step to monitoring your air chain from your instance all the way out to your distribution points. And then the media services, you can bring in all those media services data points and have connectivity status for Media Connect for a transport stream, for example, which leads me into point 2, which is I'm really happy with the availability of media services in AWS, and that's my point too, is that there's sort of a clear cloud air chain there, right? Through Media Connect, through Media Live, and a media package, and all of the associated services around it, and they bring in multiple inputs, auto failovers, real broadcast grade specifications for transport and transcode. So they really do round out what a broadcaster needs to work comfortably in cloud.
Nice.
Yeah, I'll say with resiliency and redundancy, that sort of goes back for us to our risk tolerance on different parts of the operations. But I think the huge benefit from this deployment was, from a resiliency perspective or redundancy perspective, is that it's essentially that our hardware doesn't age anymore, right? So we never make architecture compromises anymore based on aging infrastructure, right? We're able to evolve the hardware alongside the architecture, alongside the business changing, alongside the need for additional capability or flexibility or distribution points or ingest points or or even business changes. Yeah, it's not, I guess it's not so much resiliency of infrastructure anymore, but resiliency of our business and our ability to iterate over time that really gives us a leg up in this.
That tech refresh is really important when you think about it. One thing I've often thought about is, customers that switched over to S3 back in 2007. I think I was operating a Motorola StarTAC phone back then. If you think about the number of technology refreshes you could have avoided from 2007 to now, I think that kind of it's a strong statement.
Yeah.
But Joe, I want to bring up kind of a story that happened, as we were going through the evolution of Versio, and as you were making progress. I remember coming out to I think it was New Jersey, it might have been New York, but you said, hey, I'd like to give you a demo. And you pulled up Amazon Workspaces as the drive for Versio. And
yeah.
It was just fantastic. It looked amazing. You want to comment a little bit of, the backstory on that, how you got turned on to that, and, what it really meant for, it's one of the examples of the innovation and where I saw you get excited about the project, but.
Right, yeah.
So,
oh, thank you. Yeah, I was just going to say, we've embraced Workspaces as a viable solution for monitoring and operations. So for anyone on the call who's unaware, AWS Workspaces is pretty much just a secure tunnel into your virtual private cloud. So it's a thick client into a desktop workstation that you set up and that's unique per user. So this keeps your VPC really locked down, right? And you don't have to open up, holes in your security blanket or puncture holes to allow for, RDP access or other third-party, remote viewer access tools. And don't think we didn't notice AWS's push along the way for using workspaces in more and more M&E sort of operations. I was at an M&E event in December and saw usage of it for visual effects post houses and post-production houses and editors. So really, seeing that other industry or other, broadcast industries and media and entertainment industries are embracing the use of workspaces gives us a lot of confidence there. And it gives us the ability to build, full launch kits, right? So every engineer is getting their own desktop. We can pre-populate these workstations with all of the tools that they will need to be successful. Same for our engineers, same for a master control operator. We can pre-populate these with all of the UI, and they can have their own sort of environment stood up. And on top of that, and just in the last 2 weeks, we've launched a new product called Versio Control, and that's our quote unquote build a panel piece of software where you're able to make your own master control panels and sort of craft your own media operations panels. So we're excited to see what customers do with Versio Control and how they use that with workspaces.
Mike, does Sinclair use Amazon Workspaces?
We haven't in the past, but I think this is really my personal first introduction to them. It sort of became a critical piece for us. Versio being available on premise, it sort of closes the gap for us. I said before, we were looking for flexibility in deployment, right? So solving for the 80 or 90% solution and handling the other things by exception, Workspaces is part of solving those exceptions, right? It allows us to sort of squeeze that gap between, on-prem operations and cloud operations, because you still, in the end, as much as the infrastructure is in the cloud and the operations are actually happening in the cloud, some of the control layers still back on premise somewhere, right? So how do we close that gap a little bit and make it feel more seamless? I feel like I'm saying the same things, but to reduce that, sort of disruption to operations. We want to limit that, and Workspaces was just a perfect way for us to really limit disruption and sort of close the gap, make it feel comfortable, just execute on those small exceptions where we have, and I'll give you an example real quick. So although most media comes in prepped and ready, there's some that does not. And when it doesn't come in, or when there's a segment timing that's off or things like that, getting into the workspace, getting into the Versio content portal, and being able to to adjust pieces of this for them to still have that level of control. It's it sort of sounds weird, but it's still comforting, right? To really bring that to them, and it's not really impinging on any sort of flexibility in the future. So I think it became a good part of the whole process, the whole puzzle.
Well, and the fact that
on
you're
the Versio side, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jack.
Sorry, Joe, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say on the Versio side, you're getting the same UIs, the same master control UI, the same automation UI, all the same as an on-prem installation versus a cloud-based installation. So it's a UI that the operators will be familiar with, whether they're used to working on-prem or if they're used to working in AWS. It's a pretty seamless switch.
And I'll say that, when you showed it to us, it was obvious that this was a real management station. You had the ability to manage the Versio platform. You had the documentation. You had the monitoring and the controls, all at the, right at your fingertips. And
that's right.
I tend to preach in the industry, user experience and media tools are the most important thing for the end state users, and that I thought that was a great move on your part.
Thank you.
So, conscious of time here, I did want to get one more question in before we bring this to a close, and it's Mike. I've been going through the Sinclair website. You have if anyone has not looked at the history of Sinclair off their website, I would encourage you to do so. It's fascinating to see the technology innovation that they've driven. But I did notice that essentially you have a historical page that goes off of decades, and it kind of summarizes the decade of change. And you stopped at 2010. There is not yet a 2020 decade listed in that history. So, I'll start with you, Mike, actually, let's start with Joe. Because Joe, we're really excited about the fact that you guys have, built this Versio is extremely robust and looks like it's an extremely compelling offering. Do you want to talk a little bit about the future of Versio and where you're going? You just announced this panels component that was, you said, 2 weeks ago. But do you want to kind of give us a better understanding of where Versio is going?
Sure. So, the platform's always evolving and expanding. And as those changes happen, as many of those changes that can be qualified for Versio and AWS you'll be applying those changes. But I think, combining this type of robust playout operation at this level of scalability with all of the available services, and especially the media services provided by AWS, it's sort of transformational, isn't it? It's a real shift in our industry's ability to be truly agile in our on-air efforts. And I see the change, towards growth in new emerging media markets, from large broadcasters at the Sinclair scale all the way down to small teams. I think with technology like this, where it's optimized not only for performance but also for cost in the cloud, it creates a perfect storm for the creation of new television networks. So I personally feel really privileged and lucky to be working in such amazing industries, with wonderful partners like yourselves, and I can't wait to see where we take it all next.
And I'll just add one more snippet to that. And one thing that I'd love to see, and it's certainly a value, is the fact that there's this common foundation of AWS underneath these great technology partners, and we have thousands of great partners. I know that you've met a few during this progress, and sure. It's fun to watch the positive results. So thanks, Joe, at that. But Mike, I wanted to give you a minute to think about what 2020 holds for Sinclair from technology innovation. Clearly, we're starting a decade with a lot of change that no one anticipated. But what are your thoughts? Where do you think?
I think the new normal is upon us. 2020s are all about transformation for us, right? We have a technology, we have a depth of technology now available to us that really changes how we can deliver more and better content to more people on more distribution platforms. I think it's going to be about how we operate all of that. And it's definitely going to be, ATSC 3.0. It's going to be, like I said, more distribution platforms. It's going to be convergence between OTA and OTT. It's going to be, more streamlined operations so that we can prove out that sort of that operational excellence and use it to just drive the business. I think it is really about transforming operations in 2020s. I think we're being forced into it a little bit right now, but I think the writing was on the wall beforehand that this is really, it's gotten to a point where we really need to rethink what we've done in the past. We need to let go of some of the technology debt that we've had, and plot out a sort of a new path. Good.
Well, Michael, I want to thank you very much for your time. It's been exciting to participate and watch the progression of all of your projects. And Joe and Imagine, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you and your customer, about broadcast playout and how well we're progressing into 2020. So
yeah, thank you so much, Jack.
Thank you, Jack.
With that, thank you very much, everybody, for your attendance, and I hope you have a great day.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.